I've lived most of my adult life in Scranton, working long shifts at the hospital. Nursing isn't glamorous, and anyone who's been on their feet for 12 hours, juggling patients and paperwork, knows it's more grit than glory. Every other Friday, I'd sit at my small kitchen table, paycheck in hand, and prepare the same ritual I'd been repeating for years. I'd take most of what I earned, tuck it into a plain white envelope, and address it to my father. No note, no flourish, just money. The act itself was mechanical, almost sterile, but inside, it ate away at me. I never expected a thank you, and he never offered one. The handoff usually happened at the end of a weekend visit. I'd quietly slip the envelope into his palm as he leaned back in his chair. He'd nod, maybe smirk, as though I was paying dues rather than helping family. The strange thing was, in plenty of American households, supporting parents is seen as noble, a way of giving back. But in my father's house, it wasn't gratitude, it was obligation, carved into me like law. Respect is earned, not owed. I'd heard that phrase countless times at the hospital when coworkers vented about demanding patience, but at home, with my father, respect was treated like a birthright he owned, not something he ever had to earn. My paycheck wasn't seen as love, it was a tax, and I was the collector. That evening, the house smelled like roasted chicken and baked rolls. The table was full, the chatter loud, and yet I felt small. Dad sat at the head, shoulders square as if he were presiding over some court. My sister Isolde, a few years older than me, leaned into the warmth of his attention. He spoke of her accomplishments, vague words about her charm and her place in the family, as though they weighed more than the years of my double shifts. At one point, he pulled out a box and handed it across the table. I saw the sparkle before she even opened it. A delicate bracelet, fine enough to catch the light of the overhead chandelier. "Isolde deserves this," he said with pride. "She's making me proud." I smiled weakly, though the thought inside me was sharp. Funny, Dad. My paycheck bought that pride. Isolde gasped, playing her role, and he looked at her as if she'd scaled a mountain. Not one glance toward me, not one acknowledgement of what had funded that tiny display. I forked at my potatoes, chewing slowly, my hands steady only because I forced them to be. It wasn't just the money. It was the silence. My silence. And I knew, in that moment, it was punishing me more than anything he could say. In this country, we talk about how the squeaky wheel gets the grease. But I wasn't squeaky. I was silent. And silence, in my father's house, was met with erasure. The night wound down with small talk and the clinking of dishes. I helped clear the table, carried plates to the sink, and stood behind the sound of water rushing as if it could drown the noise in my head. Everyone else drifted into the living room, the television humming in the background. I lingered in the kitchen, trying to slow my breathing, to find some semblance of calm. Eventually, I sat back at the table, across from him. He leaned back, sipping from his glass, satisfied in that way men get when they believe they've cemented their authority. He looked at me and chuckled. "Don't act like it's some big deal," he said, swirling the ice. "That salary of yours, what is it, $3?" The words were casual, tossed like a joke, but they cut like glass. Isolde laughed softly, covering her mouth like she was being polite. I stayed quiet, my face still, though inside me something fractured. $3. That $3 had kept the lights on in his house more than once. That $3 had bought the bracelet he had just placed on her wrist. That $3 had fed his pride every single time he strutted in front of relatives, showing off like he was the one carrying the family. I pressed my hands together under the table, my nails digging into my palms. Words can sting worse than blows. I'd seen patients crumble under them, more than from the weight of a fall or the ache of a wound. And here I was, on the receiving end, from the man whose approval I had once thought I wanted. Americans like to believe family is built on fairness, that what you give will eventually circle back in recognition or love. But there's another side to it, one people don't admit out loud. When giving becomes expectation, when help is treated as debt, That's where generosity rots into resentment. As the evening wound down, I gathered my bag and jacket, my face still a mask. Driving home, I replayed it all in my head. The envelope passed like a tribute, the bracelet gleaming in Isolde's hand, and his mocking voice calling my work $3. Every empire crumbles not with a bang, but with a crack. That night, I could feel the cracks forming inside me. My body was weary from endless hospital shifts, my spirit drained by nights like this, and still my wages fed the image he paraded. Nurses like me, backbone workers in America, carry others, heal others, and yet we're often underpaid, undervalued, and in my father's eyes, I was worth even less. But I wasn't going to be the silent paycheck forever. He laughed that night, mocking my $3. He didn't know that laugh would come back to haunt him. The following weekend, my father hosted a barbecue in the backyard, the kind of event he loved. Half the neighborhood and most of our extended family invited, grills smoking, laughter spilling across the lawn. On the surface, it looked like a scene out of a postcard. Kids running around with sparklers, uncles turning sausages on the grill, aunts gossiping while arranging bowls of potato salad. But for me, every detail carried weight. I knew whose money had purchased the ribs, the beer, the decorative lights strung along the fence. It wasn't his pension or savings that kept these events afloat. It was the envelopes I handed him twice a month. American families often measure pride in these gatherings. It's where reputations are built, where whispers turn into stories repeated for years. And my father thrived in that spotlight, basking in admiration, as though generosity flowed from him naturally. I sat in a corner chair, nursing a glass of iced tea, my stomach knotted. He worked the crowd like a politician, shaking hands, clapping shoulders, always making sure people saw him as the man who kept the family together. Meanwhile, I noticed Isolde, radiant in a sundress, smiling knowingly at his side. She didn't look at me. She didn't have to. The smirk she wore said enough. She understood exactly where the money came from. Dinner came, long tables crowded with paper plates, ketchup bottles, and corn on the cob. Just as people settled in, my father raised his beer. He had everyone's attention, which was always his favorite stage. "This one here," he said, pointing his bottle toward me with a grin. "My youngest, she's basically my ATM, every month like clockwork." The table erupted in laughter. Someone shouted, "Wish I had a daughter that loyal." Another chimed in, "That's real devotion right there." I sat frozen, my fork still in my hand. Inside my head, my voice screamed, "They don't know loyalty when it's demanded, not given." Across the table, my mother lowered her gaze. Amaris fiddled with her napkin, lips pressed thin, eyes fixed anywhere but on me. She didn't defend me, didn't raise a word in my defense. Isolde leaned into the moment. She chuckled, tilted her head, and with feigned sweetness said, "Well, she's good for something at least." The laughter grew louder, echoing through the yard, a sound that dug into my chest like claws. I forced my expression still, swallowing the heat rising in me. Humiliation in private is a wound you can cover, but humiliation in public brands you. It doesn't wash off. That night, sitting among relatives who had known me since I was a child, I felt myself branded. I thought of something I'd once read. You can survive betrayal in private, but betrayal in public brands you. And I knew it was true. Later, when the laughter faded into chatter and plates were cleared, my father rose again, another moment of theater prepared. He reached under the table and pulled out a small jewelry box. Gasps rippled around. Everyone assumed it was for my mother. Instead, with casual pride, he turned to Isolde and pressed it into her hand. "She deserves this," he declared. "She's been working hard." The box opened, revealing a delicate necklace, the kind you don't find at a local discount store. My breath caught. The logo on the box was unmistakable. It matched the bill I had glimpsed in his papers not long ago, the one I never should have seen, the bill I knew I had paid for, indirectly, through my paycheck. A relative leaned toward another, whispering, "How sweet of him." My thought was sharp, bitter, sweet. It's theft, dressed as generosity. Mom's face stiffened. She clapped politely, but her eyes shimmered with something unspoken, a sadness she swallowed down. She wasn't the one wearing the necklace, wasn't even acknowledged. I watched as the chain slid into Isolda's hands, as she beamed at the audience of relatives, basking in admiration. I wanted to stand up, to scream the truth, that it was my money funding his show, my silence keeping the act alive. Instead, I pressed my hands into my lap, nails biting into skin, and stayed seated. My fury burned cold now, less like fire and more like steel hardening. The rest of the evening dragged, voices blurring together. Compliments rained down on him, on Isolde, words like generous and devoted tossed around while I sat invisible. My heart ached not only with anger, but guilt. Guilt that my mother was overlooked yet again, erased in the glow of favoritism. As the sun dipped and people packed leftovers into foil, I stood on the porch, the laughter still ringing in my ears. I knew in that moment the cycle couldn't continue. I worked double shifts at the hospital, feet blistered, body weary, and still I handed over envelopes so he could play benevolent patriarch. It was a performance staged with my sweat, and I vowed, silently but firmly, that it would end. The louder they laughed, the clearer I saw the end of this game. When I got home from the barbecue, the laughter still followed me like a cruel chorus. I tossed my keys on the counter and sank into the chair by the window, still in my work scrubs, too drained to change. My purse sat on the table, lighter than it should have been. The envelope with most of my paycheck was gone, sitting now in my father's drawer or wallet, already spoken for. I rubbed my temples, the sound of my family's laughter replaying in my mind. The louder they laughed, the smaller I felt. It wasn't just the moment of mockery, it was the way it settled into every corner of my life. Betrayal in public doesn't stay in the yard where it's spoken. It follows you, creeps into your walls, lingers on your skin like smoke. Sitting alone, I could still hear his voice, that smug tone declaring me an ATM. And my mother's silence, God, her silence cut deeper than his words. That night, I couldn't find rest. My body was exhausted, but my mind churned. Public betrayal opens old wounds, and mine went back further than most people could imagine. I remembered myself at 8 years old, clutching a glass jar filled with coins I had saved for months, nickels and dimes I collected doing odd chores, babysitting the neighbor's kids, returning soda bottles for the deposit. To me, it was treasure. I remember carrying it carefully to the kitchen where my father sat, his boots propped on the table. "Dad," I said, shy but proud, "you can use this to help us." He took the jar, turned it in his hands, and chuckled. "Cute. That won't even buy me a beer." The words stung, but I smiled anyway, desperate for approval. I watched as he walked out with that jar later, heard the clink of coins vanish into a bartender's till. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, realizing what I thought was love was dismissed as nothing. Even then, my value was belittled. When people are absent long enough, you invent excuses for them. As a girl, I told myself maybe he was tired, maybe he didn't mean it. But excuses rot over time, and now, years later, I saw the pattern clear as day. Nothing had changed. My giving had always been treated as his entitlement. The memory bled into the present, making the barbecue laughter louder in my head. My whole life had been one long echo of that moment with the jar, me giving everything, him sneering that it was never enough. The next day at work, I sat in the hospital cafeteria with a stale sandwich, trying to shake the heaviness. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, trays clattered, nurses in scrubs hurried between shifts. I thought I was safe, in neutral ground, but betrayal has a way of finding you. A coworker slid into the chair across from me. Her voice was hesitant. "Hey Joyce, can I ask you something? I don't mean to pry, but is it true you don't support your dad anymore?" I froze. "What?" She shifted uncomfortably. "Your cousin called my sister last night. She said you stopped sending him money. People are saying you've cut him off." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The sting from last night deepened into something darker. It wasn't enough for him to humiliate me in front of relatives. Now he was spinning stories, turning my loyalty into betrayal in their eyes. I steadied myself. My voice came out calm, sharper than I intended. I still send him money, more than I should. Funny how the story changes when it passes through the family tree. She nodded, embarrassed, and quickly changed the subject, but the damage was done. My stomach churned as I sat there, realizing my father wasn't just taking my money. He was taking my reputation, too. Private giving had become public shame. The humiliation doubled. There's a saying we toss around here: no good deed goes unpunished. I felt the weight of it press into me. I gave more than I had, and instead of gratitude, I was painted as selfish. The irony was suffocating. I pushed my sandwich aside, appetite gone. My mind raced, fury layered with clarity. Betrayal isn't just what someone does to you in secret, it's what they say about you in public. My father had managed both. That evening, walking home under the heavy Scranton sky, I thought about the cracks forming inside me. There are betrayals you can ignore, the kind you bury under chores and obligations. And then there are betrayals that demand a response. This was one of them. For the first time, I considered what it would mean to set a boundary. Not just whispering no, but carving it in stone. Boundaries weren't something we talked about growing up, but lately, they were the kind of thing you heard in therapy groups or church sermons, lines drawn to protect your sanity. Bitterness hardened into something sharper that night. I wasn't going to break down. I wasn't going to whine or beg. If he wanted to cast me as the villain, I was ready to play the part, but on my own terms. The evening after the gossip at work, I drove back to my parents' house with a kind of stillness I hadn't felt before. Not calm, not peace, more like the air before a storm. The windows glowed with television light when I pulled into the driveway. Inside, the smell of beer and fried food clung to the air. Dad sat in his usual chair, TV flickering across his face, bottle in hand. I stood in the doorway for a moment, my bag still on my shoulder, watching him. He didn't even glance at me. That had always been his way. Make me step into the room, make me announce myself, make me seek his acknowledgement. But tonight, I wasn't playing that game. "Dad," I said evenly, stepping forward. "I heard what you've been saying about me." He didn't mute the TV. He just chuckled, eyes still on the screen. "What, that you've forgotten where you came from?" His tone was mocking, but I kept my voice steady. "No, that I don't support you anymore, that I'm some kind of traitor to this family." "You know that isn't true." He finally turned his head, his grin sharp. "Truth is, you're slipping. You think because you hand me a little envelope you've done your duty? Don't forget who raised you." The room was heavy with the sound of the television and the low hum of the fridge. I felt my jaw tighten, but I refused to let my voice rise. This wasn't going to be another scene where he dictated the terms. He set down the bottle, leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His words came slow, deliberate, like he was carving them into the walls. "A daughter belongs to another family the moment she marries. Until then, she owes her father. That's you. Don't forget it." Something inside me flinched. I had always thought his insults were about money. But this went deeper. He wasn't just stripping away the value of my work, he was erasing my identity. So my worth ends when I walk down an aisle. That's all I am to him. I wanted to laugh, not out of humor, but disbelief. In this country, women had fought to prove they were more than a dowry, more than property passed from one man to another. And yet here I was, hearing the language of ownership from my own father. "Do you hear yourself?" I said softly. "Do you know how small you make me with words like that?" He shrugged. "Don't twist it. That's just the order of things." Before I could respond, my mother's voice came from the doorway. Amaris stood there, thin shoulders wrapped in a shawl, her face pale. "Joyce," she said gently, "your father is just old-fashioned. He doesn't mean harm." My chest tightened. I turned to her, my tone softer than it had been with him. Mom, every time you excuse him, you let him cut deeper. She looked down, tears shining in her eyes, caught between us like a rope in a tug of war. Her loyalty to him, her love for me, it tore her apart. I felt my anger falter at the sight of her fragility, but the truth pressed on me. When the anchor that keeps you steady also drags you under, you face the hardest choice: cut the rope or drown. My mother was my anchor, the one thing keeping me tied to this family. And yet, she was also the reason I endured cruelty longer than I should. I sat back, staring at both of them, the man who saw me as a wallet and the woman who couldn't stop defending him. My voice, when it came, was stronger than I expected. If you think I'll keep being your ATM, you're mistaken. The words hung in the air. My father blinked, then burst into laughter, a deep, mocking sound that filled the room. Big talk, he said. You'll always come back. You don't have anywhere else to go. My mother began to cry quietly, clutching her shawl tighter. She didn't plead, didn't argue, just wept softly, as though her tears could stitch together the cracks in the room. I stood, my hands steady, my heartbeat slow and certain. Inside, I knew the truth. Confrontation wasn't enough. He would laugh until the day he saw proof. I walked out that night knowing words weren't enough. The next time, I'd bring evidence. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind that dragged. I had 20 minutes for lunch, so I grabbed a stale muffin and a paper cup of coffee from the hospital cafeteria before collapsing into a chair in the corner. My purse slumped at my feet, and as I dug around for a packet of sugar, something stiff caught my fingers. I pulled it out, thinking it was another patient chart I'd forgotten to file. Instead, it was a folded sheet of paper, thicker than most. When I opened it, my stomach dropped. It was a receipt, neatly itemized from a luxury hotel in town. The date was stamped just last week, charges for dinner, wine, and a suite for two, and there, at the bottom, was my father's name. Confusion twisted into nausea, then into fury. For a long second, I just stared, rereading the numbers, praying I had misread. But the math was clear. That bill was almost the exact sum of the envelope I had handed him 2 Fridays ago. My friend and co-worker Viana slid into the seat across from me, shaking the rain off her jacket. She noticed my expression. "You look like you saw a ghost." I turned the receipt toward her with trembling fingers. "Do you think this could mean what I think it means?" She studied it once, then again, her jaw tightening. "You know it does. Don't excuse it this time." I swallowed hard, words stuck in my throat. "So he's been using it on—" "Joyce," she cut me off, her voice firm. "Paper doesn't lie. People can spin stories, but receipts don't." I folded the bill carefully, sliding it back into my purse as if it were evidence in a trial. My chest burned with humiliation and rage. In America, betrayal often comes in numbers, on bills, on credit card statements, on contracts. You can cover words with excuses, but numbers stay stubbornly true. And these numbers told me the truth I had tried to avoid. My paycheck was funding a secret affair. That night, I drove to my parents' house for Mom's birthday dinner. The rain had stopped, but the sky still pressed low and heavy, as though it knew what was coming. Inside, the dining room smelled of vanilla frosting and roast chicken. Relatives crowded the table, the atmosphere ceremonial but strained. Mom sat at the head of the table, fragile shoulders wrapped in a cardigan. I handed her my gift, something simple, a shawl I had saved for, warm enough to keep her comfortable through the drafty winters. Her eyes softened as she touched it, whispering, "Thank you, sweetheart." But before the moment could settle, my father cleared his throat dramatically, rising from his chair with a velvet box in hand. "Now," he announced, "I have something special." I watched in silence, bile already rising in my throat. He opened the box to reveal a glittering necklace. Gasps circled the table. Everyone assumed it was for Mom. Finally, something to honor her. But then he turned with a flourish and slipped it into Isolde's hands. This is for Isolde. She's been my rock." Polite clapping erupted. Isolde beamed, tilting her chin proudly. "My rock, I thought. More like my debt." Mom blinked, lips pressed tight, hiding her disappointment. She draped my shawl around her shoulders, but no one was looking at her. All eyes were on the necklace now catching the chandelier light, the chain that cost almost exactly what I'd seen on that hotel receipt. The evening dragged. As relatives murmured about Dad's generosity, I sat frozen, torn between rage and despair. A cousin leaned toward another and whispered, "How generous of Harlan!" I bit down hard, the words staying inside. Generous with whose money? Layer upon layer, the betrayal grew heavier. The hotel bill in my purse, the necklace glinting in my sister's hand, my mother's smile trying to mask her hurt. All of it pressed on me until I could barely breathe. There are moments when silence feels like complicity. And that night, watching my father bask in applause while my mother sat invisible, I realized I had been complicit too long. In America, birthdays are supposed to honor someone's life. But in my family, they revealed our politics. Who was celebrated? Who was erased? Whose sacrifices were turned into someone else's spotlight? When the guests finally left, I hugged my mother, lingering longer than usual. She whispered again, "Thank you, darling." I nodded, unable to speak. But as I stepped outside into the cool night, my hand clenched around the folded hotel bill inside my purse. It felt less like paper now and more like a blade. Words weren't enough. Proof was stronger than speeches. That night, I stopped being the silent paycheck. The bill in my purse was louder than any laugh my father ever gave. I pulled into the driveway late in the evening, the glow from the living room spilling through the curtains. My stomach was already tight, the hotel bill still folded in my purse, my mother's birthday dinner replaying in my head like a film I wanted to burn. I stepped inside, the smell of whiskey meeting me before I saw him. Dad sat hunched in his chair, a half-empty bottle at his side, his face red, eyes glassy but sharp. I stood in the doorway, bag still on my shoulder, and for the first time, I didn't hesitate. "I know what that bill means," I said, voice steady. "Stop pretending my paycheck is for this family." His head snapped toward me, anger flashing instantly. "You ungrateful brat!" He pushed himself up, nearly knocking over the table. "You carry my name. You owe me everything." I didn't flinch. My voice came calm, quiet, deliberate. "What I owe you, I already paid in years of silence." He roared then, a sound that filled the room. His fist slammed the table so hard, a glass tipped over and shattered across the floor. My mother gasped from the kitchen doorway, her hands trembling as she gripped her apron. For a moment, fear brushed my spine. But I held myself still, refusing to give him the satisfaction of watching me shrink. Inside, I repeated words I'd heard from a colleague once. In America, anger is often mistaken for authority, but authority without respect is just noise. Dad towered over me, his finger jabbing the air. "You think you can disrespect me in my own house?" I met his glare. "Respect is earned. You stopped earning it a long time ago." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the TV still flickering nonsense in the background. My mother finally stepped forward, her voice low, pleading. "Please, don't fight. Just sit down, both of you." But there was no sitting down. Not anymore. When the shouting subsided into mutters and the clink of another pour into his glass, my mother touched my arm gently, guiding me toward the hallway. Away from him. She whispered, "Don't fight him, Joyce. He'll never change. Please, just keep the peace." Her eyes were wet, her voice small. I looked at her, this woman who had endured far longer than I could imagine. My heart ached for her, but the words rose before I could stop them. "Mom, peace bought with silence isn't peace at all." Her lips trembled. She pulled her shawl tighter, as though it could shield her from the truth hanging between us. In that moment, I realized her weakness was also my chain. The love that tethered me was the same rope that kept me drowning. I left soon after, the night air biting cold as I walked back to my car. My hand shook on the wheel, but not from fear. Something else had begun to take shape. It was well past midnight when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen lit up with a name that made my chest tighten. Dad. I stared at it, debating, then swiped to answer. His voice slurred, heavy with drink, but sharp with malice. "If you stop sending me money," he growled, "don't call yourself my daughter anymore." The silence stretched as I pressed the phone tighter against my ear. My heart pounded, but my voice, when it came, was cold, clear, and steady. "Then maybe you should stop calling yourself my father." I hung up before he could respond. The quiet after the click was deafening. I sat there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, the words echoing back at me. For years I had swallowed everything, bowed my head, and kept handing him those envelopes. But tonight, for the first time, I spoke the truth out loud. Sometimes the bravest words are the quietest ones. I turned to my desk, the hotel bill still resting there. Proof. Harder than any argument, sharper than any scream. If he wanted a war, it wouldn't be fought with shouting matches. If he wanted a battle, I'd fight it in silence. And he'd never see the end coming. Sunday afternoons at Aunt Margaret's always looked the same from the outside. Folding tables set up in the yard, dishes lined end to end, kids chasing one another with plastic cups of lemonade, older cousins sneaking sips of beer when they thought no one noticed. The smell of casseroles, ham, and buttered rolls hung in the air. To a stranger, it would have looked like the picture of family harmony. But I knew better. I could feel the shift the moment I stepped through the gate. Conversations quieted for a beat too long, and eyes flickered toward me before looking away. Americans love to say family is everything. What they don't say is that family can also be the sharpest knife. I carried that thought with me as I balanced a plate in my hand, every step heavy with the knowledge of the rumors that had been circling since last week's explosion at home. I caught snippets as I moved through the yard. "She stopped supporting him, you know. Ungrateful after all he's done." The words sliced through the hum of voices like glass under bare feet. I smiled politely, though my jaw clenched tight. Relatives who once kissed my cheek now nodded stiffly, their eyes holding questions they didn't ask out loud. Suspicion sat thick in the air, heavier than the summer heat. We gathered at the long dining table later, food piled high, chatter bouncing between aunts and uncles. I tried to focus on Mom, who sat quietly near me, her fork moving mechanically as though she hadn't tasted a bite. I wanted to shield her from what I knew was coming. It happened halfway through the meal. Dad set down his fork with exaggerated care and cleared his throat, raising his voice just enough to carry. "My youngest thinks she can just quit supporting her old man," he announced, the words sharp as a blade. "Imagine that, after all I've done." The chatter died instantly. Forks paused midair. An uncle shook his head, muttering, "Kids these days forget their roots." Another chimed in, "Back then, a daughter wouldn't dare, no matter what." Heat climbed up my neck. It wasn't enough to steal my money. Now he was stealing my name. I forced myself to breathe evenly, my fingers digging into my napkin under the table. Every nerve screamed to shout, to stand up and expose the hotel bill still hidden in my purse. But I stayed seated. Humiliation scorched me, but I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. Respect and shame are the currencies of family politics, I thought. Tonight, my father spent both at my expense. The murmurs grew around me. Cousins nodding in agreement, older relatives sighing about how things used to be. Each word pressed like a stone into my chest. I sat in icy silence, my anger no longer burning but solidifying, like water turning to ice. Beside me, Isolde chewed slowly, not once glancing my way. She had always been good at pretending she wasn't involved, letting silence do her work. When an aunt across the table said loudly, "At least Isolde makes her father proud," she laughed softly. Not a denial, not a word of correction, just a smile that welcomed the praise as if she had earned it. Her silence was louder than any insult. I turned my head slightly, studying her profile. the tilt of her chin, the easy way she soaked up approval without lifting a finger to defend me. Betrayal isn't always shouted. It can be whispered, or in this case, unspoken. In families, silence can be weaponized. And that night, my sister wielded it like a blade. I replayed the words in my mind. Ungrateful, disloyal, selfish. Labels being sewn into my skin by the very people who should have known me. My chest tightened, but I sat still, my face neutral. They thought my silence meant surrender, but it wasn't. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. Instead, I observed. I memorized every face that nodded, every voice that muttered in agreement, every smirk that passed across Isolde's lips. If they wanted to cast me as the villain, I would no longer waste breath proving them wrong. Proof would speak louder than any denial. That night, my silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. I arrived at my parents' house that afternoon with the hotel bill still hidden in my purse. My steps were heavy, and every muscle in my body resisted walking through that door, but I forced myself to go in. The living room smelled of smoke and cheap cologne, and she was there, his mistress, sitting comfortably on the couch like she belonged, her legs crossed, her smile polite but sharp. Dad lounged beside her, looking too pleased with himself, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The air tightened when I entered. He looked at me, and without missing a beat, I saw him extend his hand as if expecting tribute. I handed him the envelope, my fingers stiff. He laughed, the sound booming, exaggerated, like he was performing. "See?" he said loudly, glancing at the woman next to him. "She still pays her dues. A daughter should serve her father." The mistress chuckled, reaching out like it was hers by right. He tossed the envelope into her lap as though I wasn't even in the room. My throat went dry. That laugh wasn't just at me. It was at everything I'd sacrificed. Every overnight shift, every holiday I'd missed at the hospital, every ache in my body. It was all dismissed in that one moment, turned into a spectacle for his companion. I kept my face calm, though inside, fury clawed at me. In this country, respect is a currency, and in that living room, mine was shredded in public display. He didn't just humiliate me, he broadcasted it. I stayed only long enough to avoid another scene, then left, the cold air outside hitting my face like a slap. By the time I reached my apartment that evening, my hands were trembling. I closed the door behind me, leaning against it for a long moment before noticing an envelope slipped under the crack. The handwriting was feminine, loopy, mocking. My heart sank as I tore it open. Inside was a single note. "Thanks to your paycheck, I bought myself a new purse. You should see how good it looks on me." I froze. The words blurred for a moment before snapping into focus. She wasn't just spending my money. She was spending my dignity. A bitter laugh escaped me, not from humor, but disbelief. I ripped the paper in half, then in half again, but stopped, keeping a fragment. Evidence. Proof. Paper doesn't lie. Paper humiliates. Sometimes, it screams louder than words. The betrayal doubled in that instant, his laugh, her letter. My knees weakened, and I sat hard on the chair by my desk, bile rising in my throat. Rage, grief, disgust, all collided at once. For a long while, I just sat there, staring at the torn note in my hand. The silence of my apartment pressed in, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Finally, I reached into my bag and pulled out the hotel bill, laying it beside the torn letter. "These aren't just receipts," I whispered to myself. "They're confessions." I stared at them until the lines blurred. Then something inside me shifted. My silence had always been mistaken for weakness. They thought because I didn't scream, I had no strength. But silence could be sharper than a blade when wielded right. "If they laughed at my sacrifice," I murmured, my voice low, steady, "they'll choke on my silence." The heat of reactive anger cooled into something colder, steadier, a controlled resolve. I remembered the words of Eleanor Roosevelt. "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." I had been giving consent for years, handing over envelopes without protest. that ended tonight. I folded the hotel bill and the mocking letter carefully, sliding them into a larger envelope. Not to hand over, not yet, but to keep, to sharpen. Proof heavier than any insult, louder than any laugh. The next laugh would not belong to him. He gave me the weapon himself. All I had to do was use it. The morning light crept through the blinds, painting stripes across my desk. I hadn't slept much, but the exhaustion that clung to me was different now. It wasn't weakness, it was clarity. The hotel bill and the mocking letter from his mistress lay side by side, like pieces of evidence in a trial I hadn't yet opened. I sat down, pulled out a sheet of paper, and began to write. My hand didn't shake. My words weren't heated. They were precise, almost surgical. From today forward, I wrote, my paycheck supports my future, not your indulgences. Every sentence was deliberate, pared down to truth and nothing more. No accusations, no pleading, just the facts. I was done. I would no longer be his silent paycheck. It struck me as I wrote, how in America, words on paper outlive voices in the room. A scream fades, but a letter endures. A letter doesn't shout, but it stings forever. I folded the page slowly, slid it into an envelope, and sealed it. For the first time in years, I felt like I was sealing a chapter, not just a letter. By the afternoon, I found myself walking up the familiar path to his house. Relatives' cars were lined along the street, the sound of conversation spilling out before I even reached the porch. Inside, the dining room buzzed with chatter, plates clinking, glasses raised. Dad sat at the head of the table, smug as always, a man who loved an audience. He looked at me, smirk tugging his lips, already rehearsing his next line. Without a word, I placed the envelope in front of him. My silence carried more weight than any announcement. He chuckled, leaning back. Another donation, sweetheart? I met his gaze, voice calm. Read it. The room stilled. Chairs creaked as people shifted, sensing something shift in the air. He ripped open the envelope, unfolding the page with careless fingers, until his eyes caught the words. I watched him closely. The smirk faltered. The color drained from his cheeks. And his laugh, always so quick, died in his throat. For once, he looked like a man caught without his armor. My breath was steady, my silence deliberate. I felt power shifting, not because I shouted, but because I didn't need to. The relatives looked on, confused, whispering. His hand gripped the page tighter as he reread the lines, as though they might change if he glared long enough. Then came the eruption. He shot to his feet, the chair scraping back. You can't be serious. This is a joke. I stayed seated, my voice calm. No joke, just the truth you taught me to write down. His volume rose, trembling with rage. Mine stayed level, sharp with certainty. That contrast was louder than his shouting ever could be. Around the table, relatives exchanged glances. Some shook their heads, others whispered to one another. I caught the look of my aunt, lips pressed tight, finally seeing him for what he was. For years, his laughter had power. But that day, his laugh betrayed him. It was the mask falling. Maya Angelou's words echoed in me. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. He had shown me long ago. I had just refused to see. He slammed the letter onto the table, veins rising in his neck. You'll regret this, he shouted, his voice cracking. I rose slowly, gathering my purse. Meeting his eyes, I said, the only regret I have is taking this long to stop paying for your lies. And then I turned. Behind me, the room was silent. For the first time in my life, his silence followed me. In small towns like ours, whispers move faster than cars on the highway. By the next morning, the letter I had handed my father was already old news, passed from one cousin to another, reworded and retold, until it sounded like a fable. I went to the grocery store that day, and while I lingered near the bread aisle, I heard two women talking just beyond the shelves. He made her send every paycheck, one of them said, her voice low but not low enough. And used it on another woman, the other replied, clucking her tongue. Disgraceful. I froze, my hand tightening around the shopping cart handle. Relief mingled with guilt in my chest. At last, the truth was spilling into daylight, but it also meant my family name was tarnished in the eyes of everyone I passed at the post office, the diner, the pharmacy. Still, hearing strangers finally call it what it was, disgrace, lifted something heavy off my shoulders. For once, the shame wasn't on me. News spread like spilled ink. Some relatives called to scold me, their voices clipped with loyalty to him. Others called to whisper that they believed me, that they had long suspected where the money went. Either way, the silence was broken. Chaos had entered our family's bloodstream, and nothing would ever return to how it was before. The following week brought more fallout. At a church potluck, Harlan sat with his plate piled high, the old swagger gone, but the arrogance still clinging to him. A relative, bold from the safety of the crowd, leaned forward. "You called her ungrateful, Harlan?" she said sharply. "Maybe look in the mirror before you talk about gratitude." His face flushed red and he banged his fist against the table. "Mind your own business." But the outburst sounded pathetic now, more like the tantrum of a man cornered than the authority of a patriarch. People averted their eyes, shuffled their feet, avoided his gaze. His mistress had already left him days earlier, once the steady stream of envelopes dried up. Without me, his act had no stage. Watching from across the room, I felt something unexpected, calm. For once, his rage wasn't my burden. It was his own cage, locking tighter every time he shouted. In America, communities hold their judgments close, but once released, they strike hard. Reputation can collapse overnight, and his had. The old rumor that I was the ungrateful daughter began to reverse like a tide pulling back. Neighbors now spoke differently. One evening, as I was walking home, I overheard two of them chatting near their fences. "She did everything for him," one said. "If anything, she stayed too long." "Smart woman, finally cutting him off," the other replied. The words landed like a balm. For years, my silence had been used against me, turned into proof of weakness. Now that same silence was working in my favor. I didn't have to defend myself, the truth was defending me. For the first time in years, I felt seen. Not pitied, not dismissed, seen. I thought back to the endless nights I had spent writing checks, folding bills, slipping envelopes across the table like a servant. I realized now that silence hadn't been surrender. It had been a strategy waiting for the right moment. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea cooling beside me. My mother, Amaris, sat across, her shoulders lighter than I had ever seen them, the tension drained from her face. She reached for my hand, squeezed it gently. "He thought he broke me with his laughter," I murmured, staring at the steam curling from the cup. But in the end, it was his own laugh that destroyed him. The apartment was quiet, but it wasn't the suffocating silence of before. It was the kind of quiet that settles after a storm, the kind where you know the worst has passed, but the landscape is forever changed. And as the dust settled, I realized the battle was not over, only changed. The key was warm in my palm from the pressure of my grip. I stood outside the apartment door, heart drumming in my ears, breath caught somewhere between fear and relief. It wasn't much, just a small place, tucked into the corner of a brick building downtown. But it was mine. More than that, it was ours. I slid the key into the lock and turned. The door gave with a soft click. Sunlight poured across the floorboards, catching on the freshly cleaned windows. The furniture inside was modest, a couch bought secondhand, a small dining table, 2 chairs, yet the air felt different here. Lighter, fresher, free of the stale heaviness that had clung to the house I'd left behind. Behind me, Mom stepped cautiously into the room, her hands clutching her shawl. She looked around slowly, taking it all in. I saw the lines of worry in her face relax for the first time in years. "It's not much, Mom," I said, laying my bag down by the door. "But it's ours." She smiled faintly, eyes damp but soft. "Oh, it's more peace than I've had in years." I helped her sit on the couch. She sank into it like someone finally allowed to rest. I sat beside her, the quiet surrounding us not like the silence we'd endured at home, but something gentler. A new chapter had begun, and it didn't need applause or fanfare. Sometimes freedom is just the sound of your own breath, steady for the first time. That evening, after Mom had gone to bed, I sat at the table with a cup of tea and let my mind wander. The steam curled upward, and with it came memories. I thought back to the woman I had been, the dutiful daughter, the silent paycheck, the one who never spoke up. I had been timid, almost afraid of my own strength, believing survival meant enduring without complaint. I told myself it was loyalty or tradition or love, but really, it was silence mistaken for duty. Now I understood silence differently. For years, I thought keeping quiet meant I was weak. But silence can also mean defiance. Not every war is fought with shouts. Sometimes the sharpest blade is the choice not to answer. I remembered his words, spat like poison. A daughter owes her father. I rewrote them in my mind, steady and deliberate. A daughter owes herself first. Americans often label independence as selfish, especially when it comes from women. I had heard it in whispers already. She turned her back on him. She's cold. But I no longer feared the label. If selfish meant protecting my dignity, then I'd wear it proudly. My bitterness was no longer a wound. It was wisdom, scars turning into lessons. I walked over to the cabinet and opened the drawer where I'd placed the remnants of the past. Old paycheck envelopes I'd once given him lay in a stack. I gathered them, tied them with string, and set them inside a small box. Not for keeping, not as treasures, but as reminders of how much I had endured. Mom came into the kitchen, her cardigan wrapped around her thin frame. She watched as I closed the box. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. I met her eyes. "No, I regret waiting this long." She nodded slowly, a tear sliding down her cheek, not of sorrow, but of release. On top of the box, I placed the hotel bill and the torn mocking letter. Not as shame, but as confessions. These weren't secrets to hide anymore. They were proof of what I'd survived. Above the door hung a small hook I'd screwed in earlier that day. I lifted the apartment key, heavy in my fingers, and placed it there. It swung gently, catching the light. This key didn't just open a door, it closed another. Later, I stood by the window, the crisp autumn air seeping through the glass. The city outside moved quietly, leaves scattering down the street, a dog barking in the distance. I held my tea close, breathing in the steam, feeling it warm me from within. He had lost everything trying to control me. I had found myself by letting go of him. But as I watched the world outside, I knew freedom wasn't without cost. Every choice carries weight, and soon I would learn exactly what that price was. I drove back to the house one last time, the streets familiar yet foreign now that I no longer belonged to them. The sun had dipped low, leaving a gray wash across the neighborhood, the kind of light that made everything look tired. I parked by the curb, stepped out, and carried a small box of my mother's things in my arms. The air was thick with the smell of damp leaves and old smoke, a reminder of the life I had finally walked away from. The front door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the house was darker than I remembered, clutter pressing in from all sides. The smell of stale beer and dust hit me, heavy and sour. It was a tomb of what once passed for family. Harlan sat in his chair, hunched and unshaven, his eyes glazed but still burning with that old arrogance. He straightened when he saw me. "You think you've won?" he rasped. "You'll come crawling back. Blood is blood." I set the box down carefully on the floor and met his gaze without flinching. "No," I said, my voice steady. "Respect is earned, not inherited." His jaw clenched, a vein in his temple throbbing. He tried again, his tone switching from anger to manipulation. "I gave you everything. A roof, food, my name. You owe me." I shook my head slowly. "Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I won't be fooled anymore." The silence that followed was jagged. He looked at me like he didn't recognize me, like the script he had rehearsed his whole life no longer worked. For years, he had used guilt, anger, and shame as weapons, but now they fell flat. I picked up the box again and turned toward the door. His voice followed, weaker this time. "You'll regret this." I didn't answer. Some words don't deserve an echo. Outside, the air hit me fresh, crisp. The contrast was startling, leaving that dim, decaying house behind and stepping into the late autumn light. One space drained me. The other gave me breath. When I reached my apartment later, the difference was even sharper. The place was small but alive. Sunlight spilled through the windows, catching on the green leaves of the plants I'd placed on the sill. The air smelled faintly of soap and tea, not beer and bitterness. That contrast became my clearest memory of the day. Harlan sitting in the dark, clutching nothing, while I stood in the light holding the key to my own future. Liberation wasn't abstract anymore. It was visible, tangible. Before I left his house, I had placed an envelope on the old kitchen table. Inside was my last written message, simple and final. "This was the last paycheck you'll ever cash in my name." I knew he'd open it when I was gone, that his hands would tremble as he read the words. His face would crumple under the weight of realization that his control was permanently severed. But I didn't stay to watch. My victory wasn't in seeing him suffer. It was in knowing I was free. The strongest revenge is living better, not standing around to measure someone else's downfall. Living well is the best revenge. I set the box of envelopes, the old paychecks, the evidence of years wasted, into my closet beside the hotel bill and the mocking letter. They weren't chains anymore. They were reminders. Proof that I survived. Later that evening, I sat by the window with Mom. We drank tea quietly, the amber liquid steaming in our cups. She looked healthier already, a soft glow replacing the shadows under her eyes. "He lost everything trying to control me," I whispered. "I gained everything by letting go of him." We sat in silence, but this time it wasn't the silence of oppression. It was the kind of silence that heals, the kind that feels like breathing after years of suffocation. And for the first time, the silence in my life was peace, not punishment.